Hello, Mammology. Here's our next little YouTube video. This one's going to be on dispersal, habitat selection, and migration. So basically, how do we understand why mammals are where they are located? So first, just a little bit of a distinction between dispersal and migration. Dispersal is generally a one-time or only a few times in the course of the lifespan of the animal, and the animal moves from one location to another, and it doesn't go back to its original location. So generally, this usually happens early in the animal's lifespan. So a lot of times that's the most common type of dispersal, something just after they reach independence from their parents, they'll disperse away from where they were born. But there are some cases where you can have dispersal later in life. Migration, in contrast, is a seasonal and repeated movement where the animal moves back and forth between specific locations, usually the exact same locations and usually following the same path every time. So the animal continuously makes the same patterns of movement throughout their life, moving back and forth between different locations as their lifespan moves on. All right, so let's start a little bit more with dispersal. So like I was saying, there's a distinction between natal dispersal, which is that one-time movement when the animal becomes independent from their parents, versus adult dispersal, where you can have an adult that moves from one place to another, maybe breeds there for a while, and then moves somewhere else later on. So just as an example, the top picture here is the dispersal movement of a young wolf that left a pack in eastern Oregon and dispersed all the way over to the western part of the state. So that's one example of a natal dispersal. And then another animal that's known for adult dispersal is actually lions. So male lions will disperse from the pride in which they were born. So they do have natal dispersal. Oftentimes after that point in time, they will establish a coalition with other young male lions, eventually take over a pride. They'll maintain their dominance within that pride for a period of time, and then eventually they actually do disperse from that pride to a new pride eventually. So they have multiple dispersals throughout their life. All right, so why should you disperse? So one of the big reasons why animals disperse is actually to avoid inbreeding. So if you always stayed where you were born and associated with the animals where you were born, the probability that you would actually end up mating with a close relative would be very high, because you would be close to a bunch of other relatives, your parents, your siblings, your aunts, your uncles, if you all stayed in the same place. And so a lot of dispersal is actually to avoid this inbreeding, because inbreeding, of course, can lead to greater expression of recessive deleterious mutations and is generally not good for your fitness. So oftentimes, in a lot of species, only one sex is the dispersing sex, and that actually will completely avoid inbreeding. So if let's say all the females remain where they're born and the males disperse away, then the females can all live in a familial group, but there's no risk of inbreeding because, of course, they can't mate with each other. Classic examples of this are things like ground squirrels, where you have females remaining in a single location and the males dispersing away. Another example, again, going back to the lions, is a good example of lions. The reason why males actually have multiple dispersal events throughout their life is that once they've been in a pride for a period of time, if they've been the dominant lion in a pride for a period of time, that pride is gradually going to be made up of mostly their daughters, because again, the females remain in the pride. So you have mothers and then daughters and then their daughters' daughters and sisters and lots of related females. And if a male has been the head male in a pride for a number of years, eventually many of those receptive females within the pride are going to be his offspring. So at that point, the male will disperse away from the existing pride, find a new pride where he's not related to the females in the pride. So that's one major reason for dispersal. Another major reason for dispersal is it can reduce competition between relatives. So if there's limited resources in a particular area and you are fighting with other individuals for access to those resources, if you're staying exactly where you're born and you have a bunch of siblings in the area, then you can expect to see that you would have high competition between relatives. And if you're preventing your siblings, say, from reproducing, that actually hurts your own fitness because you're losing the indirect fitness that that sibling would produce if they had their own offspring. So those are the main reasons why animals tend to disperse away from where they're born. What we do tend to see is that there is a sex bias in the dispersal. In most species, there's one sex that's more likely to disperse and one sex that's more likely to stay at home. In most mammals, that is, they do have male bias dispersal. So females tend to remain together and males tend to disperse away. The thought for that is that in most mammal species, you do have polygyny. So you have these cases where you have a single male who's mating with multiple females. In these cases, the females are grouping together either for protection or the females are limited more by their access to resources, whereas the males are limited by their access to mates. And so the females, by remaining in an area that they're familiar with, have access to more of those high quality resources. They know where everything is. They can stay in these groups of related females where you tend to get cooperative, beneficial interactions between those individuals. And that's more beneficial to the female, whereas the male tends to disperse away to find a large group of unrelated females that he can then mate with. So it makes more sense for the males to be the dispersing sex and the females to be what we call the philopatric sex, or the sex that remains where they were born. There are some cases of female bias dispersal. You do tend to see that in examples where you have monogamy. So you have a single male and a single female that are creating a pair bond. Now, monogamy tends to evolve primarily where resources are limited. And in monogamous systems, you have a lot of female choice where the females are comparing multiple males, selecting the male usually with the best access to resources, and then choosing to pair bond with that particular male. So in the case of a monogamous species, oftentimes males benefit from having access to very high quality resources. So it actually benefits the male to stay in an area where he knows where everything's at, where he can establish a territory that has very high quality resources, and that makes him most likely to be able to attract a dispersing female as a mate. So one example of this is in pikas. In pikas, females are the dispersing sex. Males tend to remain near where they were born, establish a territory close to where they were born, and then the quality of that territory will actually attract a single female mate to the pika. Okay, so when animals are dispersing, one thing you might be interested in is how are they choosing where they're going to settle? What is it that is allowing them to select a particular type of habitat where they're going to try and set up a breeding attempt? And it turns out that some animals actually have a genetic predisposition for particular habitats. So this particular example here is looking at Peromyscus maniculatus, or the deer mouse. There's a number of different subpopulations of Peromyscus maniculatus across the North America. And some of these Peromyscus live in very forested habitat, and some of them live in very grassy, more open habitat. And those habitats can actually be right adjacent to each other. And what they found is that there's genetic differences between the individuals living in the forested habitat and the individuals living in the grassland habitat, even though they're right adjacent to each other. So they actually did this study where they took mice from the field, brought them into the lab, and then gave them a choice of living in a simulated forest or a simulated grassland. And they found that mice that were from the forest chose the forest, and mice that were from the grassland chose the grassland. But then the question is that something that they learned, or is that something that is genetic, that's innate? And so what they actually did was they bred them in captivity, reared them in an environment that was neutral, and then gave the offspring who'd never experienced either forest or grassland the choice between a forest habitat and a grassland habitat. And the offspring who've never seen forest and never seen grassland, the offspring from the forest mice chose forest, and the offspring from the grassland mice chose grass, which indicates that there's a genetic predisposition to those habitat types that's innate and pre-programmed into those species. Interestingly, if you breed a mouse in captivity without access to those habitats for about 20 generations or so, they lose that preference. So it's something that's probably selected for when they're in the wild, but living in a lab situation, it's not something that's no longer under selective pressure, which is pretty interesting. Of course, there is also a component of the environment environment in which the individual was raised. So house mice, for example, reared in captivity, prefer habitats similar to the habitat in which they were raised. They did this one this experiment in house mice with bedding, and they compared a cedar chip bedding to a cellulose bedding. And how the house mice preferred the type of bedding they were reared in. They preferred to associate with that type of bedding. If you want to look at a more wild situation, you can look at bighorn sheep. Bighorn sheep were once pretty widely distributed across the western US, and now they're in much smaller locations. And there's been a lot of focus on restoring bighorn sheep habitat, but they had a lot of trouble getting these bighorn sheep to move into the new restored habitat, even if they were right adjacent to the restored habitat. These herds of bighorn sheep just weren't dispersing into these new habitats. It turns out that what's happening with bighorn sheep is that oftentimes they are moving around in these single-sex herds, either male or female herds, and within those herds there's a dominant individual, and that dominant individual leads the herd between different foraging locations. And then the young learn the routes from their mother or their uncle or whoever, and they will continue to, they'll learn it from the dominant one, and then when that dominant one dies, another one will take over and continue leading the herd along those same routes. And so they don't often move into new habitat because they have this tradition of where they forage that's passed down from generation to generation. So in order to reintroduce these sheep, it actually proved to be a much more challenging issue than they initially thought it would be. All right, so that's a dispersal. So let's now talk about migration. So migration is this seasonal movement from one location to another, and then returning back to the same location, using the same routes over and over again and the same patterns. So you probably are more familiar with migration in birds, very common in birds, but there are mammals that migrate as well. For example, the only truly flying mammal are bats, and like birds, they do often migrate. Not all bat species migrate, but some do. But they're not as good of a migrator as a bird. Flight in bats is considerably less efficient than flight in birds, and so they often don't migrate as far as birds migrate. And oftentimes what you see with bats is that they're migrating, instead of migrating all the way to somewhere warm for the winter, they will migrate to a hibernacula. A hibernacula is a place where the bats hibernate for the winter. So it's a particular cave. And so they'll migrate to that location. They'll spend the winter hibernating in that cave. And then in spring, they will disperse out to their breeding and foraging grounds for the summer, and then return to that cave in the winter. Some bats do actually follow resources, so they will migrate to where there are still free-flying insects in the winter, so they'll migrate far enough to the south to where it's warm enough that there are insects for them to eat in the winter. One really great example of that is the hoary bat, which is a very cute little Colorado bat. We have a small population of hoary bats that use the outside of the life science building as a roosting location during migration. So we'll see them sleeping on the outside of the building in the fall and in the spring as they're making their migration. Now, those hoary bats, they're going up to the Pacific Northwest for their breeding season, and then they migrate down to like South Texas and Mexico for the winter. But that's a pretty long migration for a bat. So that's about as long as they get. Much longer migration would be in the cetaceans. So many species of whales will migrate between feeding grounds and calving grounds. So if you look at the productivity of ocean waters, the colder ocean waters up near the poles are much more productive, and they produce a lot more complex food chain and a lot more food for whales, particularly the filter feeding whales. So things like krill and algae are much more abundant up near the poles than they are near the equator. So the whales will spend a lot of their time up in the northern parts or the southern parts, depending on which whale species you're looking at, foraging and putting on weight. The problem with that is that when young whale calves are born, they do not have a very thick layer of blubber. And so they're not able to insulate themselves very well against the cold water up near the poles. So whales, both males and females, actually will migrate down to the tropical waters where it's much warmer in order to calve. While they're down there, they really don't have very much access to food. So the mother whale is living off of her fat reserves. She's nursing her young, building up the young's fat reserves. And then once the young's fat reserves are sufficient, then they will migrate together back up to the north to feed on the richer food supplies there. So that allows the calves to have a lower energetic demands while they're bulking up on their layers of blubber, so that they can survive when they actually move up north. All right, another example, really classic example of mammalian migration are the wildebeest in the Serengeti in Africa. So there are millions and millions of wildebeest that do this very cyclical movement around the Serengeti plains, primarily following the rain. So different parts of the Serengeti get rain at different times of year. And the rain can actually be very, very sporadic and very unpredictable. And once it rains on these plains, there's new fresh grass growth, and there's more liquid water availability. So these wildebeest are actually following the rains so that they're having access to that fresh grass growth, which is higher in nutrition, and also access to fresh water. And they have predictable patterns where they'll move, but the rains are actually somewhat unpredictable as well. And so Rio has just entered the room. Oh, Rio, you're messing up my video. Okay. Yeah, I know, bud. Okay. What was I saying? Right. So the rains are somewhat unpredictable, and so the wildebeest can actually smell the rain from tens of miles, like up to 30 to 50 miles away. They can smell where there's been rain recently, and they'll actually time their migration around the Serengeti based on when those rains arrive in different parts of the plains, so they can get access to the food and resources. All right, so how do these animals know how to get where they're going? I may be dating myself, but anybody seen Homeward Bound? It's a really great animal movie from my childhood, about some dogs, 2 dogs and a cat that get separated from their parents and go on an incredible journey to find their way home. Anyway, animals are remarkably good at navigating, and they do have different tools that they use in order to navigate. For one thing, they have very good spatial memory. So they can actually remember the route that they've taken and retrace their steps, or in the case of hamsters, they can actually dead reckon back to where they started. So they can follow a very circuitous path, foraging, and then in their head they know which direction they've gone, and they can take a straight line back to their nest, to their home. So that's pretty impressive. That's actually a really challenging thing to do. Other animals like squirrels actually can remember landmarks and use those to navigate around. So for example, squirrels are constantly caching, that's what this little squirrel down here is doing, caching acorns in different locations, and they can remember where things are relative to landmarks in the landscape that are surrounding them. So a lot of that is spatial memory that's involved with the hippocampus, which is a region of the brain right at the top of the brain that is involved with spatial memory. Mammals can also use celestial navigation. So for example, we talked about the 13-line ground squirrel being a scramble polygyny species. So the males are constantly scurrying around looking for females. And remember, I told you that if they find a female and she's not in heat, they'll remember where she is, and then they'll scurry off and try and find some other females, and then they'll come back and check on the females, see if she's come into heat yet, and then run off. So they have to be able to find their way back to a lot of different locations. And they actually they use the sun as in the sky, and they can actually track the sun as it moves across the sky and use that to determine directions. So they actually have done an experiment with 13-line ground squirrels where they time shifted them so that they thought it was a different time of day. And then when they did that, it actually shifted the direction they were going, because if it was evening and they thought it was morning, then they actually would go in the opposite direction, because they were anticipating the sun being in the east when it was actually in the west. So that's pretty cool stuff. There's also pretty good evidence that that animals can detect magnetic fields as well. Bats have been shown to use the magnetic fields of the Earth to find their way back to their nesting or their roosting locations. So they've actually put little magnets on their heads and mess with their magnetic sense, and they can change the direction in which they fly. So that's one animal that can use the magnetic fields of the Earth. And then just a random little, you made it to the end of the video. Hopefully this will make you laugh. Dogs tend to poop, and there's a scientific paper. Someone wrote a scientific paper on this. Dogs tend to poop on a north-south axis rather than on an east-west axis. I don't know how they know which way is north and south, but they do seem to have some pooping preferences, and so that's a random little piece of knowledge for you right there. And you can actually look up the article about dogs pooping on a north-south axis. It does exist, and it's pretty funny. Hope you all are doing well. I'm going to create a discussion forum for this lecture. So if you have any questions about anything that I went over in this lecture, feel free to pop onto that discussion forum and ask them there. I'll be checking it out, and I'll be answering your questions if you have any. Stay healthy, everybody.